Well, he's been called the father of economics, but how much of what he talked about and wrote about has stood the test of time? And have we fully understood his ideas of free trade and the invisible hand? And why is a man who cared so much about the plight of the poor now seen as the poster boy for the right and those who have money to protect? That's today on the Debunking Economics Podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. Yes, we're talking about Adam Smith, of course. He was one of the characters of the Scottish Enlightenment, that time in the 18th and early 19th century when Scotland became home to a great deal of scientific and philosophical thought, away from the confines of religion and wealth. It was free thinking. Based on empirical thought and reasoning, it was the age that saw the likes of people like James Watt and Rabbie Burns and James Hutton, the geologist. Now, I'm not sure. What does Scotland give us now, I wonder, compared to those great minds? We've got Gordon Ramsay and Nicola Sturgeon and Andy, you're marrying, and of course, George Galloway.
There you go. Yeah.
But going back to Adam Smith, what did he get right and what was a bit off the mark, do you reckon?
Well, I'm going to start with where he's off the mark because I'm actually now writing the third edition of Debunking Economics, by the way, which I started on the weekend. And when I finish that, the next major task is what I'm calling my magnum opus, and I'm giving the title of that, Principles of Political Economy and Ecology.
Right. Is that going to be in 4 volumes or something?
In 4 volumes, yeah. With a fifth set of cartoons for the light readers. So I'm now thinking, how do I start that book? And I've decided I'm going to start it by calling not Adam Smith not the father of economics, but the uncle who led it astray.
Right.
Because the biggest mistake that Smith made is right in the very first paragraph or 2 paragraphs of the Wealth of Nations, and that's saying that the wealth of nations comes from the division of labour. And what you then see is this
idea that because he gave the example of the pin factory, didn't he?
And the pin factory having saying one person on their own could scarce make 1 or 2 pins a day, but by dividing it you make 500 pins per person. And he saw specialisation and division of labour as the source of.
So what's wrong? I mean, that would factually that would be right, though, wouldn't it?
No, because Joan Robinson made the very simple point that what if one person did one job, like drawing out the steel first of all to make the actual pin section, then making the heads the next day, then combining them all together. It's dividing up the work rather than the individual specialisation.
Right.
But the main point is not that at all. If you actually take a look back at a much older book by Richard Cantillon, you'll find that the opening paragraph of Richard Cantillon's is almost identical to Smith's. The big difference is that Cantillon says the source of all wealth is the free gift of nature.
Right.
Agriculture. He saw it at the time. But basically we get this, you plant one seed, you get 10,000 seeds back. There's a free gift going on. That's what pays the wages of the worker, the farm worker, and it creates the profit, which is a free gift to the proprietor of the land. And looking in terms of the energy analysis that I'm now developing further, that's right. That's correct, because the source of all wealth is the free gift of nature. Okay? We wouldn't be here were it not for the sun. We wouldn't have industry except for stored solar energy called coal or oil. All these sorts of things are exploiting an existing resource and using the energy from that resource to do useful work. So it's fundamentally it wasn't the specialisation of labour. It was creating machines that could harness the fossil fuel that we didn't even realise was fossil fuel at the time.
But I think the point he was trying to make, though, when he was talking about that division of labour was that we all have to work together, which sort of fitted his sort of philosophical approach, didn't he, that he'd written in his earlier book.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of richness to Smith. And, like, for example, I'll give you one of my favourite examples. Smith was against having a free floating rate of interest. He thought the rate of interest should be controlled by the state. He said you should set the rate of interest at a level which means that ordinary people would be willing to pay the rate you're looking at, rather than what he called profligates and projectors. And because you go back in time, and not too far before that, you have the South Sea bubble, and you had firms, people being willing to borrow large amounts of money and profiting enormous returns on what was total garbage.
Yeah.
So he said that you want to cut out the profligates and projectors and have the money being borrowed by people who are actually going to use it for sensible investment. Bentham was the one who was in favour of totally deregulated financial sector. So you find some strength and some realistic elements to Smith that are completely ignored by people who focus just on the whole invisible hand argument.
Yeah, well, before he got to the invisible hand, I mean, because he was a philosopher before he was really an economist. He wrote The Theory of Moral Sentiments.
And I have to confess, that's one book I haven't read.
Well, neither have I, but I've read books about it.
I've
read much shorter books about the longer book. But I mean, it was all about universal benevolence, basically, that we all work for the greater good. And this idea that we are, you behave like the impartial spectator. So, for example, if if you saw someone had dropped a wallet on the ground, would you pick that wallet up and give it to the person who dropped it?
The answer is yes.
The answer is yes, because you look at it as an impartial spectator. If someone was looking on, watching you, what would they think of you if you went and pocketed that money? And that impartial spectator is sort of like the tiny voice in your head that's telling you this is how we behave, and that's how
the theory of moral philosophy, theory of moral sentiments.
Yeah,
and that is part of humanity. We are, and the whole idea of seeing us as being self-interested, rapacious, and not giving a damn about the other is something which has been pasted onto Smith by people who've never read him. Yeah. That's I remember having an argument as I invited to go to a talk in Netherlands where I wasn't actually on the stage, and it was young members of the Rethinking group versus a sort of stylish but straight neoclassical economist. And he said, I'm a follower of Adam Smith. And he made some comment, and I've forgotten what it actually was, unfortunately, but I said from the audience, well, I now know that you haven't read him at all. I have certainly read The Wealth of Nations. I said, because what you've said directly contradicts Smith.
In what way? So what was he saying?
God, unfortunately, I can't remember. Right. But it was something, again, about being in favour of totally deregulated prices. And one of the Smith's phrases in The Wealth of Nations is to say that businessmen rarely get together except to form a conspiracy against the public. Yeah. So he saw business...
Well, and he did recognise that, didn't he?
Yeah, he did say...
The two types of relationships that exist, which is like we have an equal relationship, which is the ideal situation that we should be in, and then we have this superior-inferior type relationship where one is more subservient to the other, and recognise that we've got to get rid of that privileged position. So actually, he was a bit of a left-winger from that point of view.
If you look at him in terms of long-term historical context, in some ways he was arguing, as part of the Enlightenment, arguing for a market system over the feudal system. Because with the feudal system, there was a defined rank. You had to pay feudal taxes if you moved from one feudal estate to another. All these restrictions on commerce were things that the merchants were against. And a major argument made back by the feudal powers that be was that if we don't have the order of the feudal system, we'll have anarchy. Yeah. And what Smith was saying, no, we'll have this community building out instead, and people will get ahead to the extent to which they contribute to the community.
So that explains where his head was at. If you want to hear more about this discussion about Adam Smith, then you need to subscribe for this one to hear the podcast in full. You can do that by going to debunkingeconomics.com and choosing one of the subscription options there, or become a supporter of Steve Keen on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Prof Steve Keen. If you pledge to support him with $10 or more per month, then you get access to this and all the other podcasts in full. We'll be back again with another one talking about the coronavirus again. And when we return to normal, what will the new normal look like? That'll be a free podcast. Listen out for that. That's coming again soon. Thanks for listening. I'm Phil Dobbie.